Michael Bell didn't start out as a vampire hunter.
Well, yeah, it was sort of an accident.
In 1981, he was a newly minted folklorist doing a survey of southern Rhode Island when things took an interesting turn.
One of the interns working with me said, you got to go interview this guy who lives in Exeter. He's kind of the unofficial town historian. He knows everything and everybody. And she said, when we go there, you've got to be sure to ask him about the vampires in his family. So I went, what? Wait. Vampires in Rhode Island?
Exeter, Rhode Island, 1883.
In the late 19th century, the southern part of Rhode Island was sparsely populated. The Civil War had ravaged the area, and the lucky young men who'd survived the war had mostly left town for better opportunities. Deserted Exeter, as it was known, was home to subsistence farming families who scraped out their livings from the rocky, barely fertile soil. One of them was the ill-fated Brown family.
George T. Brown and Mary Eliza Brown had 3 children, Mary Olive, Edwin, and Mercy Lena. In December of 1883, Mary Eliza Brown died of a mysterious illness. Just 7 months later, one of her daughters, Mary Olive Brown, died too from the same thing. Within a few years, the son, Edwin Brown, also became ill.
By this point, it was clear that something was plaguing the family. And sure enough, Mercy Lena Brown eventually became ill as well and died in 1892. With just one remaining family member, his son, Edwin, and no solutions, George T. Brown was desperate. Friends and neighbors pleaded with him to consider the obvious. There must be a vampire haunting his family. And if he didn't act quickly, it would get Edwin next.
George Brown was alarmed. He took Edwin to the doctor, but he knew it wouldn't do any good. He knew the only diagnosis he'd get would be a death sentence, just like his wife and his daughters. He was desperate. So when his friends and neighbors urged him to try the quote-unquote old-time remedy, he agreed.
That remedy involved digging up each of the dead family members from their graves. They started with Mary Eliza and Mary Olive, who had been dead for years by this point. All that was left of their bodies were skeletons with a little bit of hair on the skulls.
But Mercy Lena had only died a couple of months earlier in January. She hadn't even been buried in the ground yet because it was still frozen solid. So they took her body from the above-ground crypt where she was being stored, and they examined her vital organs.
They were looking for signs that death was, quote, not complete, and they found them. Mercy Brown didn't look anything like her mother and sister. Her body was still fresh. Her organs were intact. Her heart had liquid blood in it. Mercy Lena Brown was clearly a vampire, an undead being subsisting on the living tissue and blood of Edwin.
The old-time remedy instructed that they should cut out her heart and liver, burn them on a rock, mix the ashes with water, and give it to Edwin to drink. Their hope was twofold. 1, that Mercy Lena would now become fully dead. And 2, that drinking this magical potion could cure Edwin. Unfortunately, it didn't. And Edwin died just a couple of months later, leaving George Brown all alone.
At this point, you might be wondering if you've clicked on the right podcast. Why is Distillations telling you a vampire story? And full disclosure, we love vampires. We've been secretly scheming about a way to get them into an episode for years. And we finally managed to do it without abandoning what Distillations is all about. You see, this story is actually about a mysterious, contagious disease. One that was often lethal, and one that science had no answers for.
Stop us if this sounds a little too familiar.
We know. We promised you we were getting away from COVID, and I'm sorry. We lied. Kind of. This story's not explicitly about the coronavirus, but there are some big parallels. The Brown family, like so many others in the 19th century, had succumbed to a mysterious fatal disease. We now know it as tuberculosis, but at the time it was called consumption. for the way it literally consumed people from the inside out, gradually making them weaker, paler, and more lifeless until they were gone. It attacked the lungs, produced a hacking cough, a wasting fever, even night sweats.
Today, we know that tuberculosis is an infectious bacterial disease that attacks the lungs. We now understand that the infectious organism that causes it is Mycobacterium tuberculosis humanus, and we have antibiotics to treat it. We also have a vaccine for it. But back in Mercy Brown's time, we had none of this. Medical science was still trying to make sense of it, even though it had been around for thousands of years, which is humbling, if you ask me, when you consider that it took scientists all of 1 year to figure out and develop a vaccine for the novel coronavirus.
Still years away from understanding the cause of tuberculosis and decades away from a vaccine, medicine at the time offered many theories of little use. And in the absence of solid medical guidance, the hardest hit, most desperate communities, many of which were isolated and rural, came up with their own solutions, like that old-time remedy. Today, they might seem ridiculous, more supernatural than medical. But however bizarre they might seem to us now, at the time they made a lot of sense for people like George Brown, who saw it as their last hope. I'm Alexis Petrick.
And I'm Lisa Berry Drago, and this is Distillations.
Chapter 1. A Germ with Fangs.
Tuberculosis, or consumption as people in Mercy Brown's time called it, has been around since at least 5000 BCE. But in the late 18th century and throughout the 19th century, it was the leading cause of death in America, in the Northeast especially. Statistics are hard to come by, but some people think it caused as many as 1 in every 4 deaths in this period.
Tuberculosis is a confusing disease. It can look very different from person to person. Some people had latent versions for years before ever getting sick. Some people had the so-called galloping variety, where it hit them hard and fast and then they died. This is the kind many people think Mercy Brown had, since she got sick after Edwin but died before him. And some people never got any symptoms at all, but judging from all the sick people around them, they were probably just asymptomatic.
Yeah.
In fact, some people think Edgar Allan Poe might have been one of these people. Everyone around Poe got tuberculosis, from his brother to his mother to his lady friends. If you were a woman and Poe loved you, well, you were screwed because they all got tuberculosis and died. But Poe never seemed to get it.
Looking back, it seems like Poe might have been an asymptomatic carrier. And it's possible George Brown was too. But for every Poe and George Brown, there seemed to be far more people with active consumption. Like the Browns, entire families could be wiped out. And it was a miserable way to go. As the disease progressed, their lungs wouldn't be able to support the oxygen supply. Their muscles would atrophy. Eventually, they'd start coughing up blood.
Starting with like spoonfuls and toward the end be cupfuls of blood. So those taking care of the sick person would come into the room in the morning and see that, oh my gosh, Mercy has blood at the corners of her mouth, and her bedclothes are stained with blood. Where did this bright red blood come from?
That's Michael Bell, the folklorist turned vampire hunter we heard from at the beginning of this episode.
Something is sucking the life, actually sucking the blood out of her. And what seems more unnatural is that it seemed to happen with young people more often. The physicians were totally unable and unaware when it came to pulmonary tuberculosis or consumption. They didn't know what caused it. It was like, oh, too much dancing. Or you live close to, there's too much water in the soil.
These were some of the other suggested causes of consumption. Excessive intellectual work, disturbed electrical energy, eating ethnic foods, overindulging in alcohol, and masturbation. In her book, Fevered Lives, historian Catherine Ott says that medical practice in the late 19th century was a virtual free-for-all. She writes, quote, "The average physician practiced a rich mixture of common sense, folklore, popular knowledge, and medical doctrine."
By today's standards, almost any 19th century doctor would be considered a quack. In George Brown's time, medicine was a smorgasbord, a combination of empirical reasoning, local customs, magic, and wishful thinking.
And throughout most of that period, the medical profession was still practicing the Galen medical tradition, which goes back to ancient Greece, of the four humors of the body, and you have to keep those in balance. So if they're not in balance, you bleed people, you make them throw up, you give them emetics. So at a time when the medical profession is cutting people and bleeding them to cure them, the so-called vampire tradition doesn't seem so crazy.
Without much else to go on, the available evidence surrounding consumption did seem to point towards vampires.
If you take a little chart and tally up the symptoms of consumption and then the attributes of a vampire, they match up very well.
Think about it. The blood around the mouth, the weakness, the pallor.
In Bram Stoker's Dracula, Lucy grows weaker and paler each day as Count Dracula drinks her blood each night. Eventually, she dies, and of course becomes a vampire herself. But those descriptions of her wasting away, becoming pale and gaunt, Stoker might as well be describing tuberculosis. Michael Bell told us one historical account of a young girl sick with consumption in the 1800s who recounts her dead sister coming into her room and sitting on her chest each night, pinning her down.
As your lungs dissolve, your chest starts to sink, and it feels like there's increasing pressure on your chest. So yeah, the idea that something's coming at night and sitting on your chest and putting pressure on you and forcing, the blood out of you, that's a vampire. This vampire was really a germ with fangs. The vampire was really a microscopic animal that was killing people.
But of course, no one knew that yet. And as tuberculosis spread throughout New England, so did the fear that vampires were the culprit. Chapter 2. The Vampire Hunter.
Michael Bell talked to us from his home in Texas right after those crazy snowstorms they had last winter. He had just gotten his water back when we spoke to him.
We went from -1, and then a week later it was 81. The ground has thawed. We can exhume bodies now.
Since Michael is the first folklorist we've ever interviewed, we asked him to give us a quick explanation of what exactly that is. He started by reading us this definition from the American Folklore Society.
Every group with its own sense of identity shares folk traditions, and that is the things that people traditionally believe, like planting practices, family traditions, vampire practices, the things that people do, like dance, make music, the things people know, how to build an irrigation dam, how to nurse an ailment, and the things that people say. Personal experience stories, riddles, songs, legends. Folklore exists alongside of official culture, but outside and not sanctioned by official culture. So we have folk history, oral history, people's memories, and then we have, official history.
Michael collects folk history by talking to people about their memories and their family legends. That's why he went to talk to that unofficial town historian about the vampires in his family in southern Rhode Island. His name was Everett Peck, and he was a relative of Mercy Brown's.
We went and met Everett Peck down at the end of Sodom Trail, of all places, and he started telling me about Mercy Brown, who was a vampire, before I could even turn on at that time it was a cassette recorder. So in the beginning of the interview, Mercy's name is gone. It just says Brown was a relative. I can't tell you how we are related, but we are related. And so I sat there enthralled really for quite a long time while he related the story of Mercy Brown.
Brown was a relative. I can't tell you right now how we're related, but we are related. My grandmother was a Brown, and it was told to me as a kid, from my mother. Mm-hmm. And when we went to the cemetery, there was Mercy Brown right side was, just one lot or two over from where my parents are, all buried. They are now. And they say, well, don't go running over there because don't touch the stone because of this awful thing that took place years ago. Now, what they do here, they change this around as if I believe in vampire. Now, that ain't what I'm saying. I'm just revealing what they believed and how they had to handle their own problems, see? They had come down with some disease, young and old, all of a sudden. And anything that they did didn't seem to stop it.
That interview with Everett Peck changed the trajectory of Michael Bell's career. Now, 40 years later, he's documented 80 vampire exhumations in the northeastern United States, mostly in New England. And he wrote a book about them called Food for the Dead, On the Trail of New England's Vampires.
Mercy Brown's exhumation wasn't an isolated event, or even one of a few. It was but one instance of a very popular practice, what Michael Bell calls the New England vampire tradition.
You know, at the time, I really believed it was just the tip of a larger iceberg, because the chances of someone telling the story and then the story getting, recorded in a place that would be accessible to someone doing research like me, not high.
Over the years, Michael has documented these exhumations by piecing together things like oral histories, newspaper accounts, and death records until they paint a picture of what happened. What he rarely gets, though, is any physical evidence, because he can't go around digging up graves. That's illegal now. But he did get his hands on an actual vampire grave in 1991, 10 years after he learned the story of Mercy Brown. He got a phone call from Connecticut's state archaeologists about a curious incident in the town of Griswold. Some boys had been playing in a large gravel pit, as you do.
And a skull popped out next to one of them and rolled down the hill with them, which kind of freaked him out. And as Nick said, he did the right thing. He didn't take it home and put a candle on and go, cool. He told his parents. And at first, the authorities thought, well, maybe we got another serial killer, because they had one in that area of Connecticut. But then they looked at it more closely. He said, no, this is a job for the archaeologists, because this is really old. These bones are really old.
The archaeologist, Nick Bellatoni, realized that this mining pit was on top of an old unmarked cemetery. He was tasked with moving its 29 graves, and in the process he discovered something really odd in one of them. It was marked JB55, most likely for a 55-year-old man with the initials JB.
He found that this person's skull had been removed from its normal position and placed basically on top of the chest, and that the two femurs were placed in a kind of cross pattern over his chest with the skull on top. They found that some of the ribs had been rearranged and broken, actually, but they showed lesions, which would indicate a chronic pulmonary disease, probably tuberculosis. In any event, would have been probably interpreted as consumption. And so we put our heads together and basically figured this was an actual physical example of exhuming a body to try to stop consumption from killing other people.
JB55 was just the latest evidence that this whole vampire business was truly a thing. It crossed state borders and eventually made its way even to Canada. It pointed to a full-on vampire panic. But how did the idea of vampires ever even make its way to rural, isolated New England in the first place? Chapter 3. Rhode Island, the Transylvania of America.
Edward G. Pettit is a vampire expert. He also creates public programs down the street from us at Philadelphia's Rosenbach Museum and Library. We talked to him about the mysterious origins of the word vampire.
The etymology of it is uncertain. We're not quite sure where it comes from. There's a Slavic opiri word. There's these other vampire, vapir, upir words. But we're not quite sure exactly when they come into language. And I like that. That in itself is like a metaphor for what a vampire is. It's so far back that you don't know where it actually comes from.
But we do know this. Most cultures around the world have some kind of vampire myth in their past. And they're all variations of the same theme, an undead person subsisting on the vital essence of a living person. The most famous brand of vampire is the one that hails from Eastern and Northern Europe. Count Dracula's home is, of course, Transylvania, a region in Romania. But vampire folklore was basically absent in England, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales, i.e. the places where New England's early settlers mostly came from.
It's a puzzling question. How could this have come to New England by at least 1784, which is the earliest case I found? To me, the answer is it arrived here with immigrants from Eastern Europe, perhaps during the Revolutionary War, when there were mercenaries hired by the British troops, the Hessians. And Hessians weren't just Germans. So we think of Hessians as Germans. They actually were recruited from all over Europe, including many places of Eastern and Northern Europe. So they could have brought this practice with them.
And of all the 80 exhumations Michael Bell has uncovered in and around New England, the majority took place in Rhode Island.
Rhode Island still is the Transylvania of America, I guess, and Exeter would be the Transylvania of Rhode Island.
Why Rhode Island? Michael Bell says it goes back to the fact that it was settled by Roger Williams, who left Massachusetts because of religious persecution. As a result, Rhode Islanders were more open to alternative ideas.
More apt to be looking at almanacs to decide, how to run their lives. They're looking at astrology. And then I think it's telling that no witches were ever executed, not in Rhode Island. It was a tolerant state. So tolerant that its neighbors sometimes said it was a sewer and a sink to which all the heretics and rogues and rascals had settled.
As vampire traditions made their way around New England at large, Rhode Islanders might have been the perfect sponge to soak them up. One case from 1784 is a good example of how these ideas could spread. Records state that a foreign quack doctor convinced a town official whose family was dying of consumption to try a vampire remedy.
We know about this incident because another town official named Moses Holmes wrote a very scathing letter right after this event to the local newspaper, warning people to beware of this foreign quack doctor who's going around saying he can cure consumption.
Clearly not everyone was pleased, but many people listened to these quote-unquote quack doctors and made the practices their own, taking what they needed and leaving the rest.
They weren't bringing with them the entire vampire tradition, which was very elaborate in Europe about how does one become a vampire, why does one become a vampire, how do you prevent it from happening, and so on and so on. So he's just bringing a cure. You got consumption, here's what you do. And that's what he was selling, and that's what people were basically buying. So, the pragmatic Yankees going like, yeah, well, I don't care about all these other details. Just tell me what I have to do to stop this problem, and I'll do it. It's a last resort.
One interesting thing to note is that most New Englanders, including the Brown family, never actually used the word vampire.
But this is besides the point for Michael Bell.
I'm looking at the procedures involved, not the terminology. What's in a word? A vampire by any other name would be just as deadly. So, no, they didn't call them vampires, but when you look at the rituals that were being performed, basically they're identical to the vampire rituals from Europe. Going to the graveyard, looking for unnatural signs, often liquid blood in the vital organs. And then what you do next exists in variation, which indicates to me that it's part of folklore, because it's been circulated long enough to become localized, that different communities will take these rituals and adapt them and change them to suit their own needs.
The ritual used on Mercy Brown was pretty typical. They cut out her vital organs, burned them, and fed the ashes to her living sick brother. But there were variations on this old-time remedy. Sometimes the sick person inhaled the smoke instead of drinking the ashes. In some parts of Europe, you burned the entire corpse. There were also variations in how people believed the vampire was haunting family members, and exactly how they were stealing their vital energy. And these were different from the vampire tropes most of us are familiar with.
Most of our ideas about vampires, we think, well, yeah, it was the first one, because then that one's taking down the others. But in the New England tradition, it's usually the last to die. Now, whether there was a serial kind of this evil thing is going from one corpse to the next, as the corpse decomposes, then I've got to find a fresher corpse, so I'm going to the next, to the next, to the next.
In just about every vampire movie, there's a scene where the vampire leaves the grave in bodily form to hunt its victims. This was not the case in the New England tradition. Not only was the term vampire absent, but so was any description of a corpse actually leaving the grave to do, well, anything.
However it was killing relatives, it was doing it by sympathetic magic from a distance. It was a vital current existing between the dead relative and the living relative. In some cases, it's described as an evil spirit of some sort, or evil angel inhabiting the corpse.
So it wasn't like Mercy Brown herself was evil. She was just an empty vessel who was inhabited by an evil force. And no one really questioned why. Why Mercy?
No, that was never, as far as I know, addressed.
At this point in our reporting, we faced a reckoning. These New England vampires, the Mercy Browns, the JB55s, they're clearly not the same as the vampires we know and love. They're frightening, not alluring. They didn't have to be invited into your house before drinking your blood, and there was no consensus on how or why they became vampires in the first place.
At a certain point in the vampire trajectory, there had to have been a split. How did we go from the horrors of consumption and death of loved ones to worrying that those same loved ones were killing other family members, to finding vampires intriguing, even sexy? To help explain this shift, we turned back to our neighbor and vampire expert, Edward G. Pettit.
Chapter 4. When did vampires become sexy?
When the COVID pandemic started, Ed Pettit began hosting a weekly Zoom event called Sundays with Dracula. He did it from his home study, dressed in a three-piece suit, drinking a cocktail, and smoking a pipe. He showed up to our Zoom interview in the same getup and even brought his favorite drink.
Port wine cask whiskey. So it was whiskey that was stored in a port wine cask to give it a little more flavor and it turns it a little reddish. And then it's also Hearing cherry liqueur, which is absolutely delicious, and I love it. And I call it the happiness you bring, which is a take on what Dracula says when you enter his castle, welcome to my house. Enter freely, go safely, and leave something of the happiness you bring.
When you say the word vampire to us, here's who we think of. Brad Pitt in Interview with a Vampire. Edward Cullen from Twilight. I mean, everyone from Twilight.
Eric Northman in True Blood, Angel Spike Darlin, Drew from Buffy, Nandor the Relentless, Nadja and Laszlo, Viago from What We Do in the Shadows, Mitchell from Being Human, Celine from Underworld.
And of course, Wesley Snipes from Blade.
What do all these vampires have in common? Well, they're hot, at least by Hollywood standards. Hollywood's made it very clear that vampire equals sex. Even Bela Lugosi in the 1931 film version of Dracula had it going on. But the vampires of old legends did not start out this way.
Before Dracula, vampires are creatures that kind of dig their way out of their graves. They smell of decay. They're certainly not attractive. It's not like they're coming to seduce you. When you read descriptions of them in these old folklore accounts, it's almost as if the vampires are more like zombies to us, like the George Romero Walking Dead kind of zombie is far more what it seems to be what they're describing as a vampire.
Vampires, like every monster in every monster story, are a manifestation of a culture's anxieties.
Monsters are meaning machines. I heard one critic call them once, that they take these things from whatever contemporary culture that they're birthed in, and the monsters carry our anxieties.
And what's more anxiety-inducing than death itself?
People were trying to figure out what was happening with certain disease outbreaks in small communities, but also try to answer questions of what happens with dead bodies and why do they look this way. But the sex thing with vampires, I don't think vampire stories are about death anymore. I think the vampire stories are now about sex. That's what the anxiety is in a vampire story. It's about the threat of the kind of erotic in our lives.
Bram Stoker published Dracula in 1897, and it became the seminal novel about vampires. But there was actually an earlier one, called The Vampire, with a Y, published by John Polidori in 1819, that Ed says points to the first attempt at making vampires sexy. His vampire wasn't a hairy, dirty beast. He was an elegant yet sinister aristocrat, and he was based on the rock star poet of the time, Lord Byron.
And there's no one sexier than Lord Byron. Stoker tries to make his vampire more beast-like than Polidori's, but he's still an aristocrat, and really, once it becomes a play and then a film, it's all over.
But as soon as people start adapting it, they're like, no, we want our vampires sexy. And they start looking and acting like us, or at least well-bred, beautiful versions of us.
I know we've just taken pains to explain how the original vampires were monsters and movie vampires are sexy, but there's actually another important connection we need to point out here. We've told you all about the horrors of tuberculosis, but somehow, because humans never fail to draw the most unlikely of connections, tuberculosis was also considered at the time, of all things, kind of glamorous.
In its early stages, tuberculosis seemed to enhance those things that were already considered attractive in women. So, for instance, the idea of pale skin, rosy cheeks, wide, sparkling eyes don't sound too bad, but they're also symptoms of the consumptive disease process. My name's Carolyn Day. I am an 18th and 19th century British historian and historian of medicine. And my specialty is actually the history of consumption, or tuberculosis, as we would now call it, primarily in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, and its connection to fashion and beauty.
That's right. Before there was 1990s heroin chic, there was 1890s consumption chic. It was the most glamorous wasting disease of the Victorian era.
Remember Michael Bell's chart comparing consumption and vampires? There could also easily be a chart comparing the symptoms of consumption and the attributes of idealized white feminine beauty at the time.
This was, not surprisingly, all contingent on race and social class. If you were white and wealthy, consumption was seen as glamorous and attractive. But if you were a person of color in a lower social class, it was nothing of the sort. In fact, it was seen as an entirely different disease. But for those in the bourgeoisie, there was a strangely positive spin to having it.
So if you were already beautiful, it would make you more beautiful, more ethereal. If you were kind of average, they thought that it could actually improve your beauty. And you see this both in the medical treatises and in the literature dealing with beauty and fashion.
And here's where we get right back to vampires.
And there are actual medical treatises that conflate consumption and vampirism. So in 1830, there is a treatise on pulmonary consumption, and they use that sort of metaphor for consumption. It says, consumption, like the vampire, while it drinks up the vital stream, fans with its swing the hopes that flutter in the hectic breast. The transparent colors that flit on the features, like those of the rainbow on the cloud, are equally evanescent and leave its darkness more deeply shaded.
If we're ruining vampires for you, we're sorry. But we're here to tell you that this whole time you've been gazing at Edward Cullen's beautiful face, you've been romanticizing a look based on someone dying of tuberculosis. That's what the whole modern vampire look is about.
Except for the sparkling. That's new. Stephanie Meyer's unique contribution to the vampire aesthetic. But there's something else that makes vampires alluring to us in the 21st century that was absolutely horrifying to people in the olden days. The fact that they didn't die.
When we first started talking about this episode, the thing that stood out to us was, well, immortality. Because there's always this tension about immortality in vampire movies. The person who's about to get turned is like, yeah, make me a vampire. Let's go. Live forever. Be powerful and strong, sexy, never get old. Sign me up. And the vampire is always like, no, you can't. You won't have a soul. I don't have a soul. Woe is me.
I'm not saying that I would definitely choose vampire immortality if I was in, Bella's position, but I think I would at least consider it. I mean, I would definitely be intrigued by the possibility. But as it turns out, this was positively unappealing to people in the 18th and 19th centuries.
And it's the thing about vampire stories now that we find to be attractive. Oh, wait, I could live forever and be beautiful? That's tempting. In vampire stories in the 19th century, that is terrifying. People think that I will never die, and they are horrified by the fact that they would be immortal. Now, we all want immortality. I want immortality. I want to read every book I own, and it's going to take me like hundreds of years to do that.
There's a lot of factors for this drastic discrepancy in worldviews from century to century, but one of them is really Christianity.
It's very much a religious response, and that the purpose of life is to one day be in paradise. And this is at least this Christian worldview in Europe and mostly where we're talking about these vampire stories. You want to die and be with God. And that's the point of life. And so if you're immortal, that means you never are going to get to be with God, and you're supposed to be. And also that staying young and beautiful just seems so unnatural to people who had no way of really doing that. Like, we have all kinds of medical ways and, surgical ways of staying young, or at least we think we're staying young, but at least the appearance of, but that's just, nobody can even imagine that up into the 19th century.
But of course, the curse of vampirism isn't just about living forever. It's about having no soul. In vampire myths in the Christian West, vampires lose their souls when they're turned. So either they crumble to dust or go to hell when they die. Not exactly a sweet gig. There are even accounts of young people who are terrified that they turn into vampires after their deaths.
In one case, a young woman is begging her parents. She knew she was dying of consumption. After she died, to promise her that they would remove her heart and burn it so that she could save her sisters. I mean, she'd heard about the stories, and so her parents consented, and that was done. It is heartrending.
No one wanted to live forever. They wanted to die when they were supposed to. And vampires were a monstrous threat. You certainly didn't lust after them or desire to be one of them. Our sexy vampires from film and literature were irrelevant to 19th century New Englanders. They were battling them in real life, or so they believed. Chapter 5. Homeopathic Magic.
So, did these rituals work?
Well, that's a good... No, that's obviously a good question. I ran the statistics on this. I don't have them available at my fingertips. But in most cases, someone else died after the ritual was performed. But then there are a number of cases where one person they were trying to save died, but the rest of the family was spared. So, I mean, was it a success or not a success? Here's a stat that kind of helps explain that. If you took the advice of the medical profession and did whatever they suggested you do, you died just as often as you did if you did nothing, and just as often as you did if you performed the so-called vampire ritual. So basically, at that time, no one had it down. No one could cure you.
In some ways, the solutions offered up by medicine were just as much based in fantasy as the vampire rituals. One popular treatment was a good old change of climate, i.e., go somewhere with fresh air and hike or ride a horse to restore your health.
Edwin was sent away to Colorado Springs, which is where people were going at that time. That's how the whole city of Colorado Springs got started, was consumptives were going there to try to, a change of climate, a dry climate, a warm climate, whatever, would help you overcome the disease. Well, it didn't help Edwin.
It didn't really help anyone. In fact, what it mostly did was spread tuberculosis around to those places. The logic wasn't entirely faulty. Dense urban centers and stuffy living quarters did contribute to spreading TB. But once you had it, the fresh air wasn't really going to do you any good. The reality was, sometimes people got better, but usually they didn't.
Some people recovered, just like all diseases. For some reason, some people were more immune to it, were able to slough it off, to recover. There were a lot of people infected with tuberculosis, thousands and thousands and thousands, who never showed symptoms.
Other proposed treatments for TB were warm sea air, seaweed placed under the pillow, and the milk of a pregnant woman, and shockingly, none of those cured it.
Meanwhile, if you look closely at the individual elements of these vampire remedies, even though they sound crazy, they're actually also based in empirical observation.
They understood contagion in a sense. They knew that, in a sense, death was contagious.
Take, for example, one way of spotting a vampire in a graveyard, by looking for a vine growing from coffin to coffin.
And if the vine reached another coffin, then another person in the family would die. So that's kind of transference of the disease there. The vine is acting as the transmitter of the disease. And some people talk about a miasma, an evil vapor. And again, all of this goes back to the notion of contagion. So it's not crazy, irrational. It's a reasonable interpretation of what was going on, especially in light of the fact that the medical community had no clue at that time.
Remember how George Brown's friends and neighbors had to convince him to perform the vampire ritual? Well, it turns out George Brown himself did not actually believe in the vampire theory. He definitely didn't believe that his own daughter was a vampire preying on others, but he did understand that his neighbors had a valid personal stake in doing whatever they could to stop the threat from spreading.
Because if you didn't stop it in your family, then it's going to come and take our family. So it was a kind of social responsibility that George Brown felt to his friend and his family to do this, even though he found it repugnant. Who wouldn't? Think about it.
And then there's the ritual itself, whether it was drinking a potion made from the ashes of a burned heart or inhaling the smoke, all in the name of healing.
What we're talking about is a form of cannibalism, but it's not so crazy to me as it might sound. I mean, it's sort of like an inoculation. It's reasonable. You take something that's corrupt, that's evil, that's diseased, you burn it, which is a purifying ritual, which gets rid of the evil, and then you take the remains of that and put them in your body as a kind of vaccine. Let's not pat ourselves on the back and break our arms doing it over how smart we are. We're no more intelligent than our ancestors who did these things. We have more knowledge, which makes us seem smarter, but we're really not. And the people who were performing these rituals were just as logical and intelligent as we are.
And when you don't have these answers, you have to go with what the available evidence is. And then they go and dig up a body, and the body's kind of bloated, and it's got blood around the mouth, and you think, well, of course, it must have been feeding on people. How it doesn't get bigger after they die? People have the misnomer that the hair's grown and the nails are grown. Well, it all makes sense. It's like a forensically sound way of figuring out what's going on, but it's all wrong.
This past winter, in January 2021, Michael Bell and archaeologist Nick Bellatoni were featured in a Smithsonian documentary about JB55, that quote-unquote vampire discovered in Connecticut when some boys collided with a skull in a gravel pit. Nick Bellatoni spoke the last line of this documentary, and it was eerily prescient, considering that all of the filming took place in 2019, before the COVID pandemic fully erupted.
He said, think about this practice, in a modern context. He said, God forbid a pandemic hit us where we cannot stop the deaths. People are going to do irrational behaviors just out of fear and love, and that's what it was all about. They were asking the same questions then that people are asking now. What's going to happen to us? Will we be safe? What should we do? What can we do? And these are the questions that are generated by the fear and uncertainty that accompany, all epidemics, regardless of the time or the place. And if these concerns aren't adequately addressed, if the answers provided don't lead to acceptable resolutions, such as not dying, primarily, then people look for answers elsewhere.
The Great New England Vampire Panic finally ended when medicine finally provided answers that led to those acceptable resolutions. But that took a while.
The first step was figuring out what really caused tuberculosis in the first place. Shockingly, it was not damp soil or too much dancing. It was a bacteria, the one we mentioned earlier, Mycobacterium tuberculosis humanus. And it was identified by a German microbiologist named Robert Koch in, and here's the twist, 1882. That's 10 years before Mercy Lena Brown died of consumption, and 1 year before her mother and sister did.
If you're shocked by this twist, that is a perfectly reasonable reaction. To be honest, we were shocked too. But one of the tragic things we've learned this past year is that identifying a threat is only the beginning of the battle.
Public health measures around sanitation certainly helped contain the spread, but didn't lead to an immediate cure. That didn't happen until 1942, with the antibiotic streptomycin. That's worlds away from sequencing a virus and having a vaccine in development months later.
The latest vampire exhumation Michael Bell found was in the mountains of Pennsylvania in 1949. But that was an outlier. Something else had helped end the vampire practice much earlier.
The practice of embalming the corpse was becoming more and more in vogue thanks to the technology increasing during the Civil War. And then Lincoln's body had been embalmed so that he could go from Washington to Springfield, Illinois by train and stop, and people could, pay their respects to his corpse. So if you drain the blood out of a corpse and then fill it with some sort of chemical, you're pretty much disarming it as a potential vampire threat, because no evil thing is going to inhabit a corpse when it can't get blood, according to the theory. So those elements came together to really spell the demise of the practice.
Who knew embalmers were the real Van Helsings?
We were drawn to this story by the wild historical medical practices, but let's be real. There's always going to be a new, frightening problem on the horizon that we've never had to deal with before and we don't understand and we don't react very well to. This story is as much about collective trauma and collective responsibility as it is about burning hearts.
Think about all the things we did in the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic to keep ourselves safe. Wiping down groceries, singing happy birthday the whole time to make sure we were washing our hands long enough. And all of these things helped and they all contributed to the collective good, but we also did them because we were scared, because we didn't know what was out there and, how to protect ourselves.
Years ago, you didn't have medicines. You didn't have nothing. You had to figure out your own. They were self-independent people. Everybody lived here. There was no such thing as relying on somebody. You did it yourself.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Distillations.
Remember, Distillations is more than a podcast. It's also a multimedia magazine.
You can find our videos, stories, and every single podcast episode at distillations.org. And you'll also find podcast transcripts and show notes.
You can follow the Science History Institute on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram for news and updates about the podcast and everything else going on in our museum, library, and research center.
This episode was produced by Mariel Carr and Rico Hernandez.
And it was mixed by Jonathan Pfeffer.
The Science History Institute remains committed to revealing the role of science in our world. Please support our efforts at sciencehistory.org/give-now.
For Distillations, I'm Alexis Pedrick.
And I'm Lisa Berry Drago.
Thanks for listening.